Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, I'm Jeremy from here. Work at ClearLeft. I'm one of the founders of ClearLeft, along with Richard there. There's another ClearLefty. If you have any questions about ClearLeft, go talk to Richard. My background's in front-end development, but I kind of want to talk about design, or the intersection of development and design. But first, I want to talk about music. I want to talk about two different approaches to music composition. Two ways of categorizing it, I guess. One approach, you take someone like this, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, classical composer, he's got the music in his head, he gets the music out of his head by writing it down in sheet music, which is very precise. Like, he can write down what notes to play for each instrument, how long to play each note. He can even provide some guidance on how to play each note. Very precise. Compare that to someone else, Miles Davis. And a very different approach. Take, for example, his classic album, Kind of Blue. The musicians go into the studio, they do not have sheet music, or they've got very, very limited sheet music. What they have are sketches, scales, right? They go in with no rehearsal. So the opening track, so what? That's literally just like, all right, we'll do 16 bars in D Dorian, then 8 bars in E flat Dorian, then another 6 or another 8 in D Dorian. That's it. That's all they have going in. And out comes Kind of Blue, which is amazing. So you've got these two very different approaches to musical composition, the kind of classical school and the jazz school. And I want to kind of compare that to two different ways of categorizing programming. In the world of programming, you can also kind of divide languages into two camps. First of all, there's imperative programming. This is where you describe exactly what the computer should do step by step. And this would be most programming languages. Most programming languages are imperative programming languages. They're very powerful, and they're quite general purpose, right? So you might write something like this, like, I want to create an array of items, loop through each one, then you test if a condition is true, return the result. Right? You're telling the computer exactly what you want it to do. And the usual things you'd expect to see in a programming language, arrays and loops and ifs and elses and returning results, all that kind of stuff. Now, the other kind of programming language is a declarative programming language. And this is where you describe what you want without describing exactly how to get that result. So you don't describe the specific steps. So these are often more domain specific rather than general purpose. And I would say they're usually less powerful than an imperative language. Though on the other hand, I think they're usually easier to learn than an imperative language, because you don't have to first get your head around, arrays and loops and all that other stuff. So a classic example of a declarative programming language would be structured query language, or SQL, or SQL, where you almost describe in English what you want, like select items from table where condition is true. And under the hood, you don't care how the computer does it. It might be that under the hood, an array is being created and it's looping through each item in the array and checking if a condition is true. But you don't care about that. You just describe what you want to happen. All right, so that's imperative programming and declarative programming. So with those two categories in mind, let's look at the World Wide Web and the languages we use on the front end of the World Wide Web. And there are three. There's the base level of HTML, where we have the structure of our content, CSS for presentation, how that content should look, and JavaScript for behavior, having that interaction. And what we have here is two declarative languages and one imperative language. The declarative languages, incidentally, are very fault tolerant, as opposed to the imperative language. So in HTML or CSS, if you make a mistake, you mistype something, the browser is very forgiving. It's just going to ignore that and move on to the bit that it does understand. That doesn't happen with JavaScript. You make a mistake in your JavaScript, the browser throws an error, it doesn't even go on to the next bit of JavaScript. I think it's possible that declarative languages can be fault tolerant, and imperative language, it's really hard to make an imperative language fault tolerant. Might not even be desirable. But that's not to say that all declarative languages are fault tolerant. For example, XML is a declarative language, but that's got a very strict error handling where you make one single mistake and the browser refuses to render it. So anyway, this is our split. 2 declarative languages, 1 imperative language. So we've got this split in programming languages, imperative and declarative. 2 different paradigms. But I think more important than having 2 different paradigms for programming is that I think we've got 2 different mindsets, 2 different ways of approaching problem solving. And I think the mindset that you have would probably influence the language you'd probably gravitate towards. If you've got an imperative mindset, you're probably going to gravitate towards imperative languages and vice versa. So let's take an example of something you want to accomplish on the web. You want to make a button. There's 2 different ways you could do this. So the imperative approach would be, you'd have minimal HTML, just use a div, and then tell the computer exactly what you want to happen. When the user clicks on it, do this. But don't forget to support the keyboard, don't forget accessibility. So you've got to account for all of that, and you've got to write all those instructions yourself. That's the imperative approach. The declarative approach is to just use a button element. A button element is interactive by default. Right? It comes with all these behaviors, you don't have to write them. Now, maybe it's just my mindset, but I know which option I would choose here, right? I would go for the button element every single time. I'm lazy. I don't want to have to write out all this stuff. The browser's going to give me that interaction by default. The browser's going to give me that accessibility by default. The browser's going to give me some default styling. So I was trying to understand then, why would anybody take the imperative approach for something like creating a button on the web? Why would you invent everything from scratch when you could just use what the browser gives you? And I think the reason why people would choose this option is that it's about control, or maybe the illusion of control, or wanting to understand everything that this button will do because you wrote it from scratch. If you've got that imperative mindset, that makes total sense. You're probably coming from a computer science background, right, where you're used to writing everything step by step, used to having that control. And in fact, the free behaviors that you would get from just using a button element, free behavior, free styling, would maybe be undesirable, right? What if there are unexpected side effects? Whereas if you invent from scratch, then you have total control. Now, using a declarative language kind of feels like giving up some control, right? You're handing over some of the implementation details to the web browser. But that does free you up, and you gain in flexibility. And I think that this approach can apply to design as well. So here's an example of taking a fluid approach to typography on the web. This is my website. And as you can see, the font size varies depending on the browser window. It's kind of tied to the browser window. Now, if you were to ask me, okay, well, what's the font size when the browser window is 960 pixels wide? I would answer, I don't know. I've given up control over that. I do know it'll look good. I do know that, whatever the browser window size is, the font size is going to work for that browser window. So this is kind of me giving up a certain amount of control and going with the fluid nature of the web. If you like this idea of fluid type, I would highly recommend checking out this project, Utopia. There's the URL, or you can open up that QR code on your camera. Very much about taking a scaled approach to typography, to spacing, elegantly scaled type and space without breakpoints. Full disclosure, this started life at Clear Left. It's Tris Mudford and James Gilead came up with this. But it's well worth checking out. Here's a diagram from the website, which I really like. Because we're like, okay, as a designer, I'm going to design the kind of lower end scenario, the small screen, and I'm going to design the large screen. And I'm going to hand over to the browser for everything in between. So I like this. There's this interaction between the human and the computer. The human is defining the boundary conditions, and then you hand over the calculations to the browser, to the machine, which is what machines are good at, right? We shouldn't be the ones doing all the calculations. Let's get computers to do that. So it's kind of like, Steve Jobs talked about computers as a bicycle for the mind. This is kind of like trying to use CSS as a bicycle for design, right? Use the browser to amplify the human decisions. And you can do that now with CSS, because there's all these functions that have arrived that are all about defining these boundary conditions. Like, what's the minimum, what's the maximum, and handing over all the in-between to the web browser. So the human is setting the boundary conditions, the machine is doing the calculations. And that kind of opens up whole new ways of designing. Someone who's been talking about this kind of new way of designing is Jen Simmons. She talks about intrinsic web design, which I quite like. That this is kind of a, going with the flow of the web. She's got this YouTube channel, Layout Land, where you can find more information about it, and very much about that combo of defining the boundary conditions and then handing over to the browser to figure out the maths to do all the calculations. Another project that I think comes from the same kind of mindset, that declarative mindset, is Every Layout. This is from Andy Bell and Hayden Pickering. They've written this whole book about doing layouts in CSS, but it's not about tightly controlling things. It's about setting up the minimum viable boundary conditions and handing over to the web browser. Even if you don't buy the book, it's well worth going to the website and checking out what they have to say. So in their axioms, I really like this. They say, instead of thinking of designing for the web as creating visual artifacts, think of it as writing programs for generating visual artifacts. I like that. And Andy Bell is one of the people behind this. He built this other website, Build Excellent Websites, for a talk he was giving. And the title of the talk was Be the Browser's Mentor, Not Its Micromanager, which I think sums up exactly what I'm trying to get at here, right? That's exactly the approach to take, the declarative mindset. Be the browser's mentor, not its micromanager. Give the browser some solid rules and hints, then let it make the right decisions for the people that visit it. I feel like there's something here amongst all these different projects, that there's something in common in this kind of declarative approach to design. So am I then saying that a declarative approach to design is inherently better than an imperative approach? The answer is, it depends, which is a total cop-out answer. Anytime someone gives you it depends as an answer, that's a total cop-up, and you should follow up with the next question, which is, it depends on what? In this case, the question of whether declarative is better than imperative when it comes to design depends on culture, the culture of the organization doing the design. Culture could kind of be split into declarative and imperative ways of working too. Let's take management, how you manage people in an organization. The imperative approach would be around measuring and control, right? It's all about the performance reports, metrics, time tracking, right? How much time is being spent. And really focusing on the outputs of the workers. A declarative approach to managing people will be focused on the outcomes. And you kind of don't care how those outcomes are achieved. You don't need to know the implementation details. If people want to work from home, that's fine. If they want to work strange hours, that's fine, as long as the work gets done. So you give them autonomy and trust, and you hope they do the work. And again, it sounds like I'm saying that one of these approaches is definitely better than the other, but they both come with their pros and cons. Like a declarative approach, giving people autonomy and trust, people can really flounder with that if they're not used to it. But that said, I mean, this is how I prefer to work. So different companies have different cultures. So there's no one-size-fits-all way of thinking that's going to work for all company cultures. And culture is something that's often implicit and unspoken, but it can be made explicit. And one of the ways you can make a company culture explicit is through design systems. Now, we might think of design systems in terms of their outputs, in terms of a library of components. But again, that's just the outputs. The design system is the processes that leads to those components. My favorite definition of what a design system is comes from Gina Ann, who says a design system is the way we do things around here, right? Focusing on the how, on the processes. And it won't surprise you to learn that I think there's two ways of approaching design systems, an imperative way and a declarative way. But before I look at those two ways, I want to back up and talk about two ways of thinking about thinking. Two ways of approaching problem solving. And these aren't two new ways I'm talking about here. This predates the digital by a long, long time. So one way of thinking, of problem solving, is analytical thinking. This is understanding how something works by breaking it down into its constituent parts, right? So, popularized by Immanuel Kant in his critique of pure reason. And this is what underpins the scientific method. And it's really, really useful for things that behave the exact same way everywhere in the universe. So for chemistry, for physics, for mathematics, analytical thinking works. It's maybe not so great when you're dealing with messy humans, I would say. Now, almost the opposite approach to analytical thinking is systems thinking. This is where you understand the parts by looking at how they work together as a whole. So to be very crude about it, analytical thinking is about zooming in, and systems thinking is about zooming out. All right, so with that said, where do design systems fit in? Well, the word systems is right there in the name. Clearly, it's got to be a systems thinking thing, right? Well, surprisingly, no. I find a lot of design systems really exhibit analytical thinking, breaking things down into their constituent parts, interface inventories, breaking things into components, atoms, molecules. Right? That's analytical thinking, as opposed to systems thinking. So let's take an example. This is from a website I work on, where we've got different button styles. And let's say I want to have a design system that's going to document the different kind of buttons we have in this product. Well, the imperative approach is I'm going to document everything. So the background colors, the border colors of all the different kinds of buttons, they're documented here. You need to know those colors. You come to the design system and you look them up. That's the imperative approach. The declarative approach, we kind of to step back and say, well, what's the relationship here? What are the conditions that are being encoded in these outputs? And you might come up with something like this, saying the border should be 10% lighter than the background color, right? And you leave the implementation to computers to figure out. But what matters is the rule, the guideline, the boundary condition you're setting there. And you could do this in CSS, right? You could do this by using custom properties and RGBA, or we're even going to have a color mix function coming soon to CSS. But leaving aside the implementation details, it is about the thinking here. This is a declarative approach to a design system. So am I saying that a declarative approach is inherently better than an imperative approach when it comes to design systems? It depends. It depends on your team and their background and their mindset. So, when I hear someone say, design systems stifle creativity, what actually might be happening there is some kind of mismatch where a declarative designer is trying to use an imperative design system, right? But equally, if you give a declarative design system where you say, make the borders 10% lighter than the background color or whatever, for someone with an imperative background, that's not useful. Like they're thinking, don't make me think, just give me the color values. That's what I want. So it depends on the team. I compared composers, right? Mozart and Miles. But let's also compare their teams. Classical musicians are trained to sight read. Like that's their superpower. Jazz musicians trained to improvise. That's their superpower. Classical musicians can play a whole new piece of music just from sheet music that they'd never even seen before. That's absolutely amazing. But if Miles Davis tried to record Kind of Blue with classical musicians, it would have turned out very, very differently. So it depends on the culture of your company. And I would say that a declarative or an imperative approach depends on one last thing, and that's the medium you're working in. Maybe that should influence the approach you take. So if you're working in a medium like print or building native apps or OS-specific apps for the desktop computers, then maybe, the more imperative approach makes sense because you do have quite a bit of control over the medium. You do know exactly how things are going to look. but I'm not sure that's going to be a great match for the World Wide Web. I think on the World Wide Web, maybe we need to be more Miles, because the web is a fluid medium. The web resists control, and that's okay. We should lean into that. To paraphrase the senator from Alderaan, the more you tighten your grip, the more the World Wide Web slips through your fingers. And some people have been saying this for a while, like back in 2000, John Alsop wrote this article, A Tao of Web Design, on A List Apart. It still holds up today, all these years later. And it's all about letting go of control, rejecting assumptions about devices and browsers and networks and people. You don't have control over how people access the web. And that's okay. 10 years after Tao of Web Design, Ethan Marcotte published this article on List Apart, Responsive Web Design. And he begins by quoting John Alsop's article from 10 years earlier. And this is like the next step in letting go of control, right? Giving up our fixed width layouts, going fluid, going responsive. And now, more than 10 years later, I feel like something's in the air. Right? Maybe there's something new happening. Is this a new era of declarative design? Maybe. That's up to you. But what I can say is CSS is an incredibly powerful tool now. So let's use it. Right? Let's lean into the fluid, ever-changing nature of the World Wide Web. It is a very exciting time for design on the web, and I can't wait to see what you're going to build. Thank you.